Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Alana James. And if you're watching live in the room, welcome very much. And if you're watching by recording, equally so. We have a conversation going on in the chat about what kinds of methodology is being used by the people in the room. And primarily at this point, it's qualitative or mixed methods, although what we're talking about today will be as appropriate for people who are strictly quantitative. And we have some people who have just finished. Congratulations, Wendy, on human flourishing. And it would be a Native American stereotype study. Actually, well, thank you for saying that, because I'll specifically speak to some things that David Boje has to say about working with indigenous populations as a result. And we've got people from all over the world, possible futures in infrastructures, English as second language. So really, I'm delighted and honored that you found this an interesting topic. But I think it's something that all researchers should be considering, because our research goes out to many audiences, not just the ones that we face at the end of our degree, but also when we publish, when we do 3-minute thesis, etc. And storytelling comes into that. So what are we going to do today? I changed the name of this, by the way. You might have seen it a couple of weeks ago when I said something about it being for qualitative researchers. And then as I revisited the work that we're going to be considering, I realized that really it's for all researchers. So slightly different title, and here's why. Data, no matter what kind of data it is difficult for people to absorb. And we'll talk about the why of that. If you've ever given a slideshow and you've suddenly put up your slides on data, you will have experienced that the whole tension of the room slows down and people start to try to absorb it from a completely cognitive place. And if you have tables up on your slides, all bets are off. It's very difficult to move on to the next slide because of the level of intensity people are giving to each little bit of your data. So it's difficult. Too much data is really what our world is evolving into. So a report from the Institute in the European Union predicted that by 2025, the volume of data would be 200 plus zettabytes in cloud storage. That's like 10 to the 17th or 18th floppy disks. So an enormous amount of data added all the time, and yet not very many regular people not trained in the sciences know how quickly to take it on. And then with that, of course, we get into all the problems of data on social media that isn't correct, that tells a bad story, etc. So that's the world that this conversation to scientists is dropping into. So the ability to tell a story, because it involves your reader, but yet to tell it in a way that is precise and gives the full story, will help your work find its audience, but it will also help the entire world of science progress. That's what we're talking about. Our agenda. I'm going to talk about storytelling as an ideology as it translates to science in the current vernacular, and what we're finding. A couple of different kinds of resources on the web. I'm going to introduce you to Storytelling Science by David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile, and use some of their slides to talk about some interesting process ideas. We're going to put them together for quantitative research and discuss the takeaways from this overarching discussion that we might want to consider for all research. All right, so storytelling, lot of conversation on the web about storytelling, a lot of conversation in marketing and other fields, non-research oriented, but who might be pulling out data and trying to get that data across to other people. But as it translates to science, I found three very interesting and very different resources that I wanted to pass on. So this is one from a company who business is to sell people like you editing services, but they're playing to a master's and doctoral audience. And they had an article about that was comparing storytelling to science, and it gives us the basics. In fiction, we have a character who needs to get something done. In science, we have a purpose for our study. In fiction, we have a background, who they are, what the context is, what they're up against, and how they're going to try to get it done, the kind of the ups and downs of their study. And we have literature that we base as our background, and methodology that is going to carry us through. In fiction, they have highs and lows. There's a climax, and then they're trying to give us a satisfying ending. In research, we have results, that's the climax, and the discussion builds the satisfaction. But the satisfaction, as sometimes happens in tragedy in fiction, is not necessarily a positive outcome for our research, but something has been learned. So pretty standard. Okay, back and forth, we can go with that. Now, then we get into a discussion on Nature magazine about the pros and cons of taking on a storytelling progression narrative. And they're saying there are some limits to this analogy. We must distinguish between the use of rhetorical techniques as a tool for conveying information, plus the scientific study. What they're really getting to is, and I think this is across the board in science, we're worried about if we make it too easy to understand and take in, are we cutting off some of the edges that actually make it science? And are we going too far down the slippery slope of trying to give the reader what they want to see as the positive outcome rather than what we actually had? So if this article, and I've given you the link, is a little bit of a back and forth about whether or not we should be doing this. But I found a few of these quotes worth looking into. Science is conducted by people situated in time, space, culture, and society, struggling for credibility and authority. That's true for all of us. And so an argument for our papers to be written purely as factual blow by blow does not sufficiently take into account this wider reality, such as the fact that we are struggling for credibility and authority across a wider range than just our committees at the end of our degrees. We don't want to be the kind of scientists who are read by 6 people, or very few of us do. I did know a person who worked for ProQuest who was very happy to write the kind of papers that very few people read. But if she was published in her field, just to be published was an accolade. I am not that kind of a researcher. My work needed to go to a broader based field because I was dealing with educational concerns and how we got people through PhDs. So depending on who you are and how big the audience is for your work, you'll need to position yourself perhaps in writing 2 papers, perhaps writing a very technical, maybe even jargon heavy paper that plays just to the finite areas of your field, and then 3-minute thesis, papers in magazines that are more widely read, even though they are journals. There's a wide variance, isn't there, in the size of the audience that any one of our journals actually has. And the wider the audience, the more likely the people reading your work will need to have it come to them in a way that they can flip through on their lunch hours and find something of value. But I thought we'll come back to this point later. We need to tell our failures as much as our successes, because our failures are what we want other people not to replicate, and will help us take the field a different direction. And we need to end with a conclusion that includes this counter narrative. That's difficult in a story. Some examples, though, that I thought of were, I've read some fiction where the main character was kind of an anti-hero, one who had a basic disorder, or maybe the character you kind of love to hate. They don't always end on a positive note. They're frequently aimed at being a failure, but yet they move us along because the intricacies of what goes on are interesting to us. So there are ways in which we can use the same ideas that fiction writers use to increase the size of our audience. Now, if you're interested in going deeper into this, I highly recommend this particular YouTube. It's an hour long. It was produced by 3M Corporation. It is a man who works with scientists and helps them get their studies to a wider magazine audience, primarily magazine or conference audience. So he might be helping the people who are your next keynote at something that you attend. And I found it very interesting, and so I'm pulling out for you today just some things to consider. He says science has often said facts speak for themselves. He disagrees. Facts do not speak for themselves because very few people know how to interpret facts just by themselves. Information does help make change happen, but not by itself, because we need more than information to make decisions. And if you are in a component of science where you really hope other people take it on board and do something, and he's referring frequently in this to the conversation about whether or not immunizations were good during COVID. The people writing about immunizations and how the vaccines were developed, etc., wanted people to feel comfortable taking the vaccine. So there's an outcome they wanted people to have, and they didn't necessarily understand that people needed more than information. They needed to create meaning from the information, and that meaning needed to be significant. Well, during COVID, a lot of people who didn't take on science normally were frequently looking at scientifically oriented reports and data because it was significant to people around the world. Right, so that's one whole section to think about. How many facts do you have for your research? Which particular facts are the ones that, if you tell your story to other people just out loud, that causes them to go, oh, yeah, that's important. And then how do you put those facts up front in such a way that that importance becomes obvious to your reader and helps them make decisions? And then how do you build towards an outcome where the decisions might be laid out for them, but your results and your findings clearly lead a certain direction? You're making a case for some particular kinds of action. Okay. Now, And again, I take you back, I say to you, if this is interesting to you, please go watch this video, because he goes into how to exploit ways in which people think. And I thought this was fascinating. When we hear a story, when we hear any information, we are actually matching patterns. We take what is available and we match it to something we already know. So if you're playing to your committee and they all come from your field, then they will have a lot of patterns that they are matching your research to. But if you're playing in a 3MT to an audience who doesn't know your field, then you want to match the patterns of what you are saying in such a way that it matches other things they would know in their general everyday lives. Critically important, I think. Cause and effect is a pattern people understand. So if you have cause and effect in your study, then that will work. Abstract ideas do not have that pattern matching. Theoretical ideas do not have that pattern matching. And many of our studies actually rely heavily on the theoretical understanding. So how do we back off from that and take it down to a level where it helps people match patterns they already know and have emotional tagging? So what is emotional tagging? It's very simplistic. Good, bad, right, wrong. Simple, this or that, emotional responses. So if we start a medical study with how many people are impacted by the disease we are studying, then already we have emotionally tagged the study and people are saying, oh, that's bad. We do want a solution to that. Humans prefer social knowledge rather than other kinds of knowledge. So if you can tag to a wider social effect, again, you'll get your audience on board. And humans are suspicious of change. So if your end result is that there's some change you want people to take on, then you want to be aware that there's going to be some suspicion about your ending and back it up with evidence or other ways of working. Just those 5 lines, I think, are very important for all of us to consider as we write. So then he takes us back to a story's structure knowledge. We need to find ways that honor science and our audiences. So this flips me then into the storytelling science, which is a qualitative, written by David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile, based on decades of their work. And it's written up as a qualitative science, but I think everyone will find things of value here. So I'm working from how to use conversational storytelling interviews for your dissertation. I had a copy when it was in press. It is still available on the web, and I've given you the draft version link. You can also look up David Boje. That I gave you the link to his Vita, but that will drop him. DavidBoje.com will drop him into his website. He's a very theoretical man, and it's easy to. He follows big ideas and circles around, just to prepare you for the kinds of things you find when you work with David. Okay, so the basics from a qualitative point of view. Theoretically, what is storytelling science? So now I'm playing to those of you who are going to or involved in qualitative research, and you'll be required to write up your methodology. And so I'm giving you some context, theoretical context, for where storytelling science fits into the broader range of theoretical issues that go on in qualitative research. So grounded theory developed 30, 40 years ago now, has had many reiterations. David thinks of their work as the fourth wave of that. It's that you also might be familiar with narrative inquiry, where you work with a group of people, usually can be done one-on-one interviews, but usually a group, and you're asking people what are the positive things, have to tell you the stories of their significant issues that you're studying. So it's an advance on that, and I'll be more specific in a minute. And it's an ethnographic research because you're literally in the ground working with the people that you are, quote unquote, studying. Although he has some flavors on it that make it less of a study, less of a me up here, you down there kind of study. That was a challenge with some qualitative ideologies. So that puts it in its theoretical place. This is his, but one of you mentioned, so I'm glad I included it, that you were working with indigenous ways of knowing. And they have done, Grace Ann especially has done a lot of work with the different portions of people around the world who would come from what is broadly topicked, the beginning cultures or the indigenous cultures in our global context. Frequently, those cultures have a completely different way of looking at the world. And many of you might be studying subpopulations within the broader culture in a more industrialized portion of the world and still find the same thing. Different people think about the world differently. And so this is a layout of where this work fits in all of that. These last two slides given to you just because you may at some point have to justify your work to other people, and you can reply back to them. Okay, why is storytelling science important? 4 reasons, and I'll go into this because it plays very definitely on the topic of how we wrap, why we would take a slightly different approach and process to our methodology in order to get that much more credibility out of it and make it easier to tell the story. So storytelling science, they would say, is important because it uses our humanity as researchers to get past the discussion of bias. What do I mean by that? In old-fashioned, I'll call it old school qualitative research, the scientist had ideas about what they wanted to study and put together questions and then went out and did interviews asking the same questions of everyone. It did not take into account that the nature of questioning is biased to the researcher. So then, of course, we had all the things we had to do in order to show that they weren't giving us the answers we wanted to hear. Well, this team of researchers suggest that if we change it from an interview to a conversation, and as human beings, if we unpack our ideas and our biases as we are discussing it, whatever the topic is, with the people that would have been our interviewees, we go to an even plane with them and we unpack our biases in such a way as to let the other person address them and agree with them or not. And we can have a more substantive conversation about the intricacies of our ideas as they approach to our topic. A bit more difficult, takes a bit more, it takes a lot more listening and a lot more ability to be transparent with the people that would have been the interviewees, but more along the lines of ethnographic work in general, which also tried to have us be on an even keel with the people that were the study. It's always been a challenge. And then I'll go specifically into how the process, which allows us to look for divergent information. Remember, the previous people said that we need to unpack the divergent information for our ultimate audience if we're going to storytell. Well, this particular kind of science has a way of doing it where we look for that divergent information, and I think that would be good for qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, everybody, just to keep this process in mind. It gives us a framework. He calls it the anti-narrative, and I'll show that to you, that helps us investigate the context so that our findings take root. Now, this is interesting from the point of view of the listener and the building of a story, as when we superimpose it on the things in the last section. And for those of us who like stories as a way of understanding, these ideas take us further. And anyone who is interested in indigenous ways of knowing versus Western ways of knowing, this particular format and process is very much in line and easier to work with, and in a population that thinks differently than A plus B plus C equals cognitive development, if that makes sense. So these are his slides, and I'll just go through them quickly. I'm hoping that you can ask questions, and I hope to make sense. Okay, so it starts with this place where you are transparent and willing to share your biases about the conversation. And so I'm beginning to do some work with older people, and I had a conversation just yesterday that really helped me unpack my biases. My biases about places to live and whether or not it's useful to have these big structures and buildings where a lot of old people live together. My bias living in Ireland is that it's better to have old and young all out in the same community. But in this conversation I was having, the other person definitely had, the other was definitely thought I was biased and made suggestions that this other way of working was better, the one I didn't like. You want to be able to unpack where you are first, and that's where we start. Then you go out and you have what he's calling an analytical comparison, and then you self-reflect. So you go out and you talk to somebody about it, and you talk about what you're thinking, and they're talking about what they're thinking, and you take really good notes and you think about it. You self-reflect on your what this conversation did or did not do to help you switch your thinking. So you're the process that's going through this, and you're aware of this as you go. Which, if you know qualitative research, you'll understand why it's similar to narrative inquiry, but he would say an improvement because of the back and forth. You do that again. You do it many more times. This is pretty typical. But what he also has is, once you think you know something, once you've gotten to the point where in previous forms of qualitative research you would have stopped, you then go and specifically ask people who they know that thinks completely differently about this than this conversation you've had. So you're having pretty good, yeah, we all agree. We see this world. We've done this thoughts. We've taken this thing apart, and it's feeling pretty comfortable. At that point, we look around and we say, okay, who's got really divergent ideas? Who wouldn't we talk to normally if we hold this set of ideas? And we specifically go off and look for those people and start that conversation by saying, I've built up this pretty good repertoire about whatever my topic is, but I understand from others that you might see it quite differently. Please help me see it from another point of view. And then after, what might be many, many circles here of back and forth, we come to a place where we've found the middle ground. We've found the place where both parties can say yes, and the edges of that yes that we can build into our story, that it's things are a continuum, they aren't. So our claim is that we understand the continuum of experience rather than the experience of most people. And then we build our arguments around that. I want to say that for those of us who are using many forms, and both David and Grace Ann are proponents of what many universities would call mixed methods, because throughout this, you're looking for divergent information, and sometimes the divergent information comes in data, as well as humans talking about their lived experience. Or you might start off by having an inductive and deductive discourse, if you would, with the data, and pulling together what looks like the claim, and then going out and discussing that claim with people who have experienced something along on your topic, and seeing whether they agree with that. So, which is a pretty typical mixed methods approach, to get something, do research on it, come back to the people to see what they think, that back and forth. And he includes it here, and it might be many forms of data. So we talked in the beginning about stories needing to come into a place where the human, be told in a way that human beings who don't have our background can see it in their patterns, and can see put it in a place, whatever we're saying, in a place that's simple in their minds, of good and bad and right and wrong, and something from the past and something from the future. And he puts this, he calls it anti-narrative, and he sees it between two poles. So he would say that as you're writing, storytelling would say, as you're writing, you're seeing what the abstract is, and you're getting to a place of what is grounded, and you're working to tell the narrative in the middle. And you're seeing the parts that were the historic, so that's our literature in a lot of cases, and you're seeing the future, which is the where your evidence is pointing and the actions you want to take, and you put those things in the narrative. And the narrative has, then you're naturally working with the tensions of those two directions. So I'm going to give you lots of resources to take these things and mull them over in 45 minutes. All I can do is bring up the highlights of some high-level thought, and hopefully get you to a place where you know whether or not you get instinctive feelings about whether or not this could fit with something, and then you have some direction about where you can go get the references that will take it further for your own explanation, and how you might use some of these. I think the easiest thing to put into place, and this is what was my step for thinking about it as a quantitative researcher, is the process. So there's message, there's structure, and there's words. And each one of those things we need to consider carefully. And at the end, when we're looking at, I know what I have way more than I could possibly ever put in an article, and yet I want to say something. The something I want to say is my message. The structure then, I'm going to put it together in a way that will meet the needs of my audience. So if my audience is my committee, then I need to show them the breadth and depth of my research process, and I need to convince them that my results and findings are credible and well thought out and carefully studied, and I need to have outcomes and recommendations that seem reasonable. And my words, if I'm talking to my committee, can be edging towards heavily jargon, because it isn't jargon at the level you're speaking to your peers. It carries very specific meaning. But if you are taking that same message to an audience in your university's 3-minute thesis, then you will need to consider what words can relay your message and in such a way that nothing's going to be confusing. So what do you want your audience to do, to feel, to think, course of action? And then you begin to think about the structure of how you put that together. And this author, and this is referring back to the 3M, the man who was speaking to a larger audience for 3M on telling a story scientifically, talked about mind maps. So this is a mind map easily available. It's something that goes with a particular software package. But the science of global warming. And if that's your topic, then you know that there are many streams. Your mind map will have many different discourse that you can use about global warming. And you might actually have several stories there, depending on which discourse you are following. Historically based will tell a story of something in development. It will help an audience get to a place where they can embrace change, because they see the natural evolution and they see that you're not just throwing change at them. Remember, people are suspicious of change. If you're solving a problem, global warming, you have to think of what the problem is. You have to show how bad the problem is, and then you have to show ways that people could get over it. And you might want them to sort their trash differently. You might take it down to getting rid of plastics in their life. Whatever it is that you're going towards, you need to consider the human effect. And then you have the structure. Now, a narrative structure, if you have ever done any research into how people do storytelling for entertainment purposes, it generally starts off with a character and we get their background. They have one or more challenges. And if it's a series on television, they have challenges that frequently end up as more of a challenge at the end of the structure. And then, so there's kind of an up and down feeling of challenges got a little better, challenges got a little better. They can be quite complex, or it can be pretty much like climbing a mountain. So if we look at mythology, we see Hercules went out and he had many challenges and he got over all of them and he came home, and then there was the final big challenge and a happy ending. That mountain, if you would, is a narrative structure. So what's your ending going to be? Let's start there. Is your ending that you want a change? Is your ending that you learned a lot? Is your ending that one of the things you learned was that this methodology didn't get to that question at all and your study was a disaster? What is your ending? And then you jump to the start. So are you presenting a mystery? Do you start with a disaster and then right away the dike came down, people are flooded, and how are they going to get past that? Or are you saying, something very mysterious here, we have to study it, we go slowly through our study? So you have to think about how to start. And I just have to share one thing he said, because I was very interested in it, was don't start with what he calls a throat clearing. Here in Ireland, almost always speakers start by thanking the people who invited them and thanking the people in the room and da-da-da. This particular author says, don't do that. Start, because it's too precious. Your first 30 seconds is too precious. You don't want to give it away by talking about yourself, you want to get the audience hooked. And then if you need to be polite, back down and say thank you or whatever, consider doing it. Anyway, it was interesting from a cultural point of view, so I thought about put it in. More about narrative. Figure out the points then. You've got your ending and you've got your start, and then you want to figure out your points in between. How many ups and downs are there? Is it a pretty straight, you had this problem, you saw this literature, you did this methodology, you got these results, and then it's not, that's pretty forward. But if we take David's circle, you started with some biases, you had some conversations, you thought about things differently. That's the first hoop. Because you thought about things differently, you did a little bit more, and then you went way. Third hoop is you went out looking for the disconfirming evidence, and that took you to this other place where you can pull together a contextual story across a continuum of possibilities. You have to know how your structure is going to go. And then you go out and you, like in all things, you look for models of other people who have used that same kind of structure, so you know what your narrative arc can look like. Narrative arc is the start, the little crises, or one big crisis, how it's fulfilled. And I've given you a book here. We have Houston, we have Narrative, Why Science Needs the Story, that was particularly recommended. Challenges, not easy. Jargon is a challenge. You have to have enough to please certain audiences. You can't have very much if you're talking to a general population. Jargon makes people suspicious. It creates distance. They don't listen. It puts your work on the confusing side of their simple emotional responses. So every sentence counts. Even a sentence that takes a person away from the narrative that you want to give it is one that you can lose your audience. And then we all have to consider within this the use of metaphor, so that we aren't saying things, or if we are saying something at a higher level, we drop down and say, for instance, it's simplistic, but it's a bit like da 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 da. Make sure everybody is along with us as we travel the pathway of our narrative. Another book on the rhetorical act. It's older, but heavily thought of. And I read the reviews, and I would say, if you can get a hold of it, and maybe there's a revised edition beyond this one. It looked like it was a book everybody who's going to speak in public should consider thinking about. Okay, so how do we put this together? Where do we take it from here? In my reflections at the end of this, I had 3 takeaways. You might have different ones and more, and I would love it if you shared. Science needs to find a bigger audience. And our specialties really need to find a bigger audience. So reframing our work in a storytelling limelight should help. The way the scientific story is told has to be credible and needs to include the pluses and the minuses, our successes and our failures, our disconfirming evidence. So we need to be able to use a narrative that takes people over, that brings them along with us, but takes us over a few ups and downs. And the Boje and Rosile process, in my opinion, does have implications for both qualitative and quantitative storytelling, because it gives us a process and also holds us accountable for our own biases, which of course we have. And the more we do science, the more we realize our own biases and how they get in the way of what we thought we knew and how we thought we put our research together. So I end today, and I'm hoping that you will have questions about how it might work for your work, or because I'm hoping you've been sitting here thinking, how am I going to do that? Or what about this? So the handouts have the slides, and I have 3 in the PD.education resources. The first 3 are specific to Boje and Rosile. Both of them came and spoke a few years ago, and I interviewed them. It became very long-winded, and I kind of repackaged those interviews in a couple of ways and then did an overview, a capstone. That's the first 3 links. And then the second 3 links second 2 links are about presentations, because we may not use storytelling in our dissertation or thesis writing very much, although it is useful to kind of wrap our head around it and consider our work in these ways, because it might help us branch out and be more creative. But we probably will use it when we are speaking to audiences. And the bigger and broader our research goes, the more audiences we speak to, and the more interest these kind of ideas should have. So that does it for my set of slides. And now I'm very interested to hear from you. Was it interesting? And if so, what parts? And are there sections here? I'll just go back to the kind of the agenda. Were there parts here we'd like to revisit because you had questions? So I'll give it a minute to chat. If it made sense and you're heading out the door, that's fine too. I'm always thankful to have a chance to speak to researchers and to see whether these ideas play in your world and in your science and on your campuses. Very good. Very good. It's 6 o'clock where you are, so easy to have to go. You're welcome. You're very welcome. I hope they are ideas that have play long after today. I can end the webinar, but I want to give you a chance, if you have a question, to stay around and type. You're welcome. So if you have a question, if you would just put an X in your message box, I'll wait. Early in learning about research, excited to have thoughts and ideas, embark into research. Jennifer, excellent. And really, I hope those resources at the end are useful to you. Oh, excellent. When you're looking at Indigenous perspectives, go to Boje and Rosile and don't hesitate to actually write them emails and ask them questions. These are people who you can definitely reach out to, and they are delighted anytime there's research with Indigenous populations. Thank you very much. You're very complimentary. So I'm getting the feeling that we don't have questions. I'm not seeing X's, so I'm going to end the recording, and I'll be